The release of Halo 2 will always be referred to as one of the largest ever recorded, especially following the release of Halo Combat Evolved. People were lining up outside of Toys R Us stores for hours before launch. Countless news channels were making bits and articles about both the fans and the games, and then being equally floored by just how quickly this game sold. And coming off one of the most revolutionary games since Doom, it was understandable to see why so many people wanted to see what was coming next for Master Chief and their struggle against the Covenant. Talking about the launch of Halo 2 feels like something that you need to do when talking about why Halo is so important to gaming. Not only because it showed just how dedicated gamers were to the things they loved, but also because it's a great reminder as to why there were so many conflicting thoughts when Halo 2 released. The story, yet again, was incredibly cinematic and very well written, but the gameplay looked nothing like we'd seen in the E3 teasers that shown off earlier those years. The combat and movement were still way smoother than anything we'd seen before this, and even compared to a lot of games today, it still holds up. But again, the development was rushed, and that left a lot of big rough patches, like for example the insanely unforgiving difficulty that is in pretty much every option you have. Playing Halo 2 on easy is like playing Halo Combat Evolved on normal, or maybe even hard, and that's not a joke. Compared to Halo Combat Evolved's shield and health system, Halo 2 relies purely on shields with no health indicator at all. This wouldn't be much of an issue if the shields were strong to compensate for that, but instead they were weakened before release, meaning that in Legendary you essentially have 2 hit points before death, and 1 if you're up against sniper jackals. This is for a number of reasons. The main one is just how difficult the development of this game was. Entire missions were cut down to being just cutscenes, and there were quite a few features that weren't actually finished before the game was released. This was actually something that my game design classes dove into quite a bit, talking about planning and making sure that things are done on time while also not adding any bloat or mechanics that don't really fit in the game, making sure that all of the time that could be wasted on those are spent on instead making the foundation of the game that much stronger. It's a lesson that I still think needs to be touched on quite a bit, considering just how many games are being released today with massive issues that could have all been fixed if they just cut back on some of the smaller mechanics or things that really don't need to be there. That's not to say that everything about Halo 2 is bad. In fact, it's still a great Halo game. The enemies and the story are incredible, even if a little cheesy now. The gunplay is fast and satisfying, but out of all of the Bungie Halo games, this is probably the weakest. And while it sucks to say that, I've come across countless sticking points during my time playing, and nearly every single one of these would have been fixed by just giving you an extra half a second to react in combat. Things like getting one-shot by a sniper that you didn't notice, or having an elite hide around a corner just to melee kill you reminds me of some of my least favourite parts about FromSoft titles, which I call punishing the player for not knowing. While I don't believe it's 100% intentional when it comes to Halo 2, these games will punish the player for not knowing things that have not been established beforehand. A great example of this is mimics in the Dark Souls series. Upon approaching a chest in Dark Souls, it may have a chance of being a mimic, where if you open it, you'll be grabbed by the mimic, losing a massive amount of health and then needing to fight it should you survive the initial trap. At least, that's how it feels upon first interaction. Mimics in Dark Souls are placed ahead of time, and there's a way you can actually tell whether or not they're normal. If the chain attached to the chest is wrapped in a circle, that symbolizes that the chest is safe. And now that you know that, it might seem like a simple enough sign, but for someone who doesn't play the game or refuses to look up guides, there is almost no way of knowing about this mechanic outside of just blind guessing. And that's why I call it punishing the player for not knowing. Yes, once you know what to do, the task can seem fairly easy, but why should I need to explore and research the game outside of the tools that the game itself gives me? Which brings me to another glaring issue I've had with this game, which has been mostly fixed in the Master Chief Collection, but still deserves to be touched on. For anyone who doesn't know, while playing the original campaign in co-op, both players would share one life. That doesn't sound too bad, but considering you can be killed in a matter of seconds, it starts to get a little more ridiculous. Jackal snipers are relentless, especially in the first few missions. There are tons of moments where you'll be trying to move through an area just to get meleeed from around a corner and end up dying, or being hit by a grenade you were barely aware of. It's not only frustrating because of just how often it happens, but also with how rare checkpoints are in this game. Meaning that after a death you may need to replay the last 10 minutes all over again just to have this happen again. There's also quite a few moments in levels where you'll be stuck in really slow moving platforms waiting for things to happen, and these really pull me out of the game. I actually find it quite funny how some people will be fine with moments like this in Halo 2, but will then trash other games that do the exact same thing, and I will tell you from experience, it's more than okay to have moments in your favorite game that you aren't the biggest fan of. I also feel like the Flood are handled quite poorly in this game, not because the Flood themselves aren't interesting, but more because all of the Flood missions, regardless of whether you're playing as Master Chief or the Arbiter, range from incredibly boring to incredibly infuriating. Something that Bungie did incredibly well with this installment was the way they told their story. And I'm not talking about the story itself, but instead about the moments in-game you come across. The dialogue of the elites reacting to their brothers being massacred by the brutes, the Arbiter slowly realizing that the prophets were betraying them, and the way that Cortana and Chief take advantage of the confusion to complete their mission. Honestly, pretty much all of the best story beats come from the Covenant side of the story, which I'm really not opposed to. Bringing complexity and meaning to an enemy is a really important part of any story that runs this long, which is why, even though the recent Doom games are outstanding gameplay wise, they're pretty boring when it comes to characters and events unless you dig really deep into the codex or other resources outside of the game. That's not a bad way of approaching a game either. It just means that the developers can focus on making the game engaging and then wrapping the story around it to give meaning as to why everything is happening. And honestly, for a game like Doom, it's exactly what that title needs, and it feels kind of like what this game did as well. But sadly, there are a lot of moments showing off scenery or travel with nothing really happening during it. Which brings me to another point of contention for this game. In my eyes, the color palette of Halo 2 is actually really boring, and while some of the scenery is quite breathtaking at first, the rest of the levels will dissolve into the same greys, browns and blues that we've been seeing for the rest of our time in the game, which doesn't help when you add the incredibly linear corridors we see ourselves being confined to outside of a few exceptions. Even a lot of the vehicle sections feel like long hallways where not a whole lot is happening, and if it weren't for the outstanding soundtrack and exceptional voice acting, I'd probably have cared less about this game than I do Halo 4.
Take care, Arbiter. What you say is heresy.
Is it? Oracle, what is Halo's purpose?
Collectively, the Seven.
Wrong! Not another word!
Please. Don't shake the light bulb.
As I've been saying, Halo 2 isn't a bad game. If anything at the time, people just wanted more Halo, which is exactly what this is. It might not be the most mind-blowing installment, but it did everything that it needed to keep intrigue in the franchise and set up a really solid base for the rest of the series to launch off of. It's just severely overhyped, but I can still understand why it's so fondly looked back on. But considering how revolutionary Halo Combat Evolved was, this feels like a much harder rerun with a lot of bland patches, even to the point where the first and last missions feel like they're stripped straight out of Combat Evolved. And I find that this game does still fall into the traps of being the middle section of this trilogy. Introducing new characters or things that should have been there from the beginning, moments in gameplay that feel kind of stunted or like they're trying to bridge a gap that they missed earlier, and boss fights that, in all honesty, I never really thought fit the Halo games super well. All that being said, dual wielding and hijacking were introduced in this game, as well as damage actually being shown on vehicles before they would either stop working or explode. The idea of showing the Covenant's struggles and hierarchy was also pretty revolutionary for gaming at the time, as well as being an incredible setup for what I feel is the strongest of these three games.